They demanded champagne at dawn and absolute silence on set. In the golden era of British entertainment, immense talent was often accompanied by a monstrous ego. While the public adored them as national treasures, their co-stars lived in constant fear of their icy glares and sharp tongues. From the cobbled streets of soap operas to the silver screen, these women believed they were untouchable deities. But what happens when the applause finally stops? Today, we expose the 10 most arrogant and difficult British actresses of the 60s to the 90s. Who was the ultimate diva? Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Let us begin. Hilda Baker. In the gritty world of British comedy during the 1970s, few stars shone as brightly or burned as dangerously as Hilda Baker. Standing less than 5 feet tall, she was a giant of the music hall tradition, but behind the laughter lay a temperament that could shatter an entire production. She is best remembered for her role as Nellie Pledge in the sitcom Nearest and Dearest, a show that was beloved by millions for its warmth and humor. However, the reality of the filming process was a grim psychological war. Hilda did not merely dislike her co-star, Jimmy Jewell, she despised him with a venomous intensity that became legendary in the industry. She viewed herself as the singular star of the show, the sun around which all others should orbit, and she treated Jewell not as a partner, but as an obstacle to her glory. The atmosphere at Granada Studios was toxic. For 7 long years, spanning from 1968 to 1973, Hilda refused to speak a single word to Jimmy Jewell unless the cameras were rolling. The moment the director shouted "cut," a wall of ice would descend. She would turn her back on him, refusing to even acknowledge his presence in the room. This was not just a clash of personalities, it was a campaign of dominance. Hilda was known to deliberately sabotage scenes if she felt Jewell was getting the upper hand. She would fluff her lines on purpose during his best takes or move erratically to distract the audience's attention away from him. Directors were terrified of her. She refused to take direction, claiming that she knew more about comedy than anyone else alive. Her arrogance was fueled by deep-seated insecurity and paranoia. As her health began to decline in the mid-70s, she struggled to remember her lines. Rather than admitting she needed help, she lashed out. She demanded that large cue cards be hidden all over the set, behind vases, inside drawers, and even taped to the backs of other actors. If a co-star accidentally obscured her view of a card, she would fly into a rage, accusing them of trying to destroy her career. She believed she was a god of comedy, untouchable and omnipotent, but her behavior alienated everyone who tried to help her. By the time Nearest and Dearest ended, few people in the industry were willing to work with her. She died in 1986, a lonely figure who had pushed away the world to protect an ego that eventually consumed her. Violet Carson. To the millions of viewers who tuned in every week, she was the hairnet-wearing, stout-drinking moral guardian of Coronation Street. When the show launched in 1960, Violet Carson became an instant national phenomenon, embodying the formidable matriarch Ina Sharples with such convincing ferocity that the line between the actress and the character completely vanished in the public eye. However, the woman behind the scowl was far more terrifying and far more arrogant than the fictional character ever dared to be. Violet was not a working-class woman from the back streets of Manchester. She was a refined, classically trained pianist and a soprano who had performed for royalty. She harbored a deep, simmering resentment that her immense fame came from playing a character she privately considered to be common and vulgar. This internal conflict manifested as a towering superiority complex that terrorized the corridors of Granada Studios for 2 decades. She walked the set not as an employee, but as a queen inspecting her subjects, and she expected absolute deference from everyone she encountered. The stories of her behavior in the rehearsal room have become the stuff of television legend. New actors joining the cast were given a strict, whispered warning by the production crew. Stay out of Violet's way at all costs. She had a specific, high-backed chair in the rehearsal room that was considered hallowed ground. If a naive newcomer or an extra dared to sit in it or even place their coat upon it, they would be subjected to a humiliating public dressing down that left them shaking. Violet did not suffer fools, and she defined a fool as anyone who did not know their lines with absolute perfection on the first take. She viewed acting as a serious discipline, akin to an orchestral performance, and she had zero patience for mistakes. If a younger actor stumbled over a line or missed a cue, she would stop the entire rehearsal, sigh loudly enough to be heard in the next room, and stare at them with withering contempt until they crumbled under the pressure. Her influence over the show was so immense that she began to believe she was the sole author of its success. She was known to rewrite scripts on the fly, taking a red pen to the work of professional writers. If she felt a line was too common or did not suit her dignified view of herself, she would cross it out or change it without asking for permission. The writers and directors were often too intimidated to challenge her, allowing her to effectively direct her own scenes. She held court in the actors' green room, and her approval was the only currency that mattered at the studio. A kind word from Violet could make a career, but a raised eyebrow or a cold shoulder could destroy a young actor's confidence forever. She operated with an air of aristocracy, famously refusing to mix with the crew or the extras, maintaining a rigid barrier between the talent and the workers. This arrogance extended aggressively to her interactions with the public. While other stars of the era embraced their fans, Violet loathed the intrusion into her private life. She famously hated being addressed as Ina on the street, correcting well-meaning fans with a sharp, icy tone. She refused to sign autographs on anything she deemed scruffy, such as scraps of paper, napkins, or cigarette packets. She would tell fans that if they wanted her signature, they should present her with a proper photograph or a clean book. Violet believed she was doing the British public a massive favor simply by appearing on their screens, and she felt she owed them nothing more than her performance. She remained on the show for 20 years, her power absolute and unquestioned. When she finally retired in 1980 due to declining health, the studio was left with a massive void. She was a brilliant tyrant who demanded respect but rarely gave it in return, leaving behind a legacy of fear and awe that few could match. Noelle Gordon. If Violet Carson ruled the North with an iron fist, Noelle Gordon was the undisputed, sparkling Empress of the Midlands, a woman whose influence over British television in the 1970s was nothing short of imperial. As the flame-haired matriarch Meg Richardson in the soap opera Crossroads, she was one of the most famous faces in the United Kingdom, attracting audiences of up to 15 million viewers a night. However, Nolly, as she was affectionately known by the public, was far more than just a soap actress. She was a television pioneer who had helped launch the ATV network itself. This unique position gave her a sense of ownership over the studio that bordered on absolute delusion. She did not behave like an employee who could be hired or fired. She behaved as if she owned the bricks and mortar of the building, and for a long time, the executives were too terrified to tell her otherwise. Her arrogance on the set of Crossroads was legendary and all-encompassing. Because she had previously worked as a television executive and a presenter, she believed she knew better than the directors hired to manage the show. It was commonplace for Noelle to stop a scene in the middle of a take, not because she had forgotten a line, but because she felt the camera angle was unflattering or the lighting was not highlighting her best features. She would march up to the control gallery, a forbidden zone for actors, and instruct the technical crew on how to do their jobs. She would dictate where the other actors should stand to ensure they did not block her light, and she even had the final say on the lunch menu in the canteen. Her dressing room was not a mere workspace. It was a lavishly decorated throne room filled with fresh flowers, fan mail, and gifts that she insisted be displayed for visitors to admire. Noelle lived in a bubble of her own creation, surrounded by a court of sycophants who were too afraid to challenge her authority. She genuinely believed she was untouchable, a deity of daytime television who could do no wrong. Her arrogance was not always malicious, but it was dangerously blinding. She acted as if the standard rules of the industry, punctuality, humility, and cooperation, simply did not apply to a star of her magnitude. She would invite the press into her home to photograph her lavish lifestyle, reinforcing her image as a star who lived high above the common people she entertained. However, this godlike status she had painstakingly built for herself eventually became the very weapon used against her. The new breed of executives at the network grew tired of her immense power and her refusal to adapt to the changing landscape of 1980s television. They decided that no single actor, no matter how beloved, should be bigger than the station itself. The fall of the Queen was swift, brutal, and played out like a tragedy. In 1981, she was summoned to a routine meeting and told, without warning, that her contract would not be renewed and her character would be written out. Noelle was reportedly in such a state of shock that she could barely speak. The idea that she could be fired from her show was simply incomprehensible to her. She had convinced herself that Crossroads could not exist without her presence. When the news broke, the public outcry was immense, with fans picketing the studios, but inside the industry, it was seen as the inevitable collapse of an ego that had grown too large to sustain. She spent her final years trying to understand this betrayal, never quite grasping that her own sense of superiority had painted a target on her back. She was a legend who forgot the golden rule of show business. Even gods can be overthrown by the people who built their temples. Rachel Roberts. She was a force of nature, a Welsh firebrand with immense talent and a temperament that could summon a storm in a clear sky. Rachel Roberts was the undisputed queen of the kitchen sink realism that defined British cinema in the early 1960s, winning a BAFTA for her searing performance in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning and an Oscar nomination for This Sporting Life. However, her personal life was a chaotic hurricane that often spilled over into her professional relationships, terrifying directors and co-stars alike. Rachel did not just believe she was a star, she believed she was a tragic heroine in a play written by the gods, and she demanded that everyone around her play their supporting roles to perfection. Her arrogance was not the cold, distant superiority of the upper classes. It was a loud, aggressive, and emotional dominance that sucked the oxygen out of every room she entered. She required the absolute attention of everyone present, and if the spotlight drifted away from her for even a second, she would reclaim it with shocking volatility. Her marriage to Rex Harrison, a man known for his own colossal ego, created a toxic cocktail of Hollywood glamour and destructive behavior. Together, they were the royalty of the acting world, but behind closed doors and on film sets, they were a war zone. Rachel believed that her talent gave her a free pass to behave however she pleased. She was known to be notoriously difficult with production staff, often treating assistants and makeup artists as if they were invisible or, worse, enemies. She was a method actress before the term was widely understood in Britain, immersing herself so deeply in her roles that she often lost touch with reality. If a scene required her to be angry or miserable, she would remain in that state for the entire day, lashing out at anyone who dared to approach her with a friendly word. She terrified her colleagues by refusing to break character, creating an atmosphere of intense unease that lasted from the first call to the final wrap. The stories of her social behavior are legendary in their cruelty and excess. At dinner parties with the Hollywood elite, Rachel would often dominate the conversation, performing rather than conversing. She had a habit of holding court, where she would tell long, dramatic stories, and woe betide anyone who interrupted her or tried to change the subject. As her career began to slow down in the 1970s and her marriage collapsed, her behavior became darker and more erratic. She struggled with her inner demons and relied heavily on spirits to cope, which fueled her paranoia and aggression. She would show up to auditions expecting to be offered the role without reading, insulted that she even had to prove herself. On one infamous occasion in Los Angeles, in a desperate bid to reclaim her husband's attention, she made a spectacular and horrifying scene at a party, effectively diving onto a dinner table. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered ego and desperation that alienated her from the very industry she sought to conquer. Her refusal to accept that she was no longer the leading lady of the 1960s led to her ultimate undoing. She could not comprehend a world where she was not the most important, most vibrant, and most talented person in the room. Directors began to avoid her, not because she lacked skill, she was arguably one of the most gifted actresses of her generation, but because the emotional toll of working with her was simply too high. She spent her final years in a state of bewilderment and rage, furious that the world had moved on without her permission. In 1980, unable to bear the silence of a fading career and a broken heart, she tragically chose to leave this world. Her legacy is one of brilliance shadowed by a personality that was too big, too loud, and too demanding for the mortal world to contain. She remains a cautionary tale of how immense talent, when coupled with an unchecked ego, can devour the very person it made a star. Pat Phoenix. If Violet Carson was the stern moral conscience of Coronation Street, Pat Phoenix was its beating, fiery heart, and she knew it with every fiber of her being. As the legendary Elsie Tanner, the siren of the cobbled streets, she brought a level of Hollywood glamour to the drab, rain-soaked reality of Northern England that had never been seen before. With her flaming red hair and a cigarette permanently perched between her fingers, she became an instant icon in 1960. However, Pat Phoenix did not just play a diva on television, she lived the role 24 hours a day. She was the undisputed superstar of the soap opera world, and her behavior on set reflected a woman who believed she was far too big for the small screen. She carried herself not as a working actress, but as a screen goddess from a bygone era, demanding a level of adoration and special treatment that left her colleagues both awestruck and terrified. The rivalry between Pat Phoenix and Violet Carson was the stuff of legend, a clash of titans that divided the cast and crew into two fearful camps. While Violet demanded silence and respect for the craft, Pat demanded attention, noise, and constant validation. She viewed herself as the primary reason for the show's massive success, often reminding producers that it was her face on the magazine covers, not the others. This belief in her own indispensability made her incredibly difficult to manage. She would often arrive on set late, sweeping in with an entourage or a journalist in tow, completely disregarding the tight shooting schedule. If a director tried to hurry her along, she would fix them with a glare that could curdle milk and remind them exactly who the star of the program was. She refused to be rushed, and she refused to be directed by anyone she deemed unworthy of her talent. Her dressing room was a sanctuary of excess in a studio known for its frugality. While other actors shared cramped spaces, Pat insisted on having the best room, which she transformed into a boudoir fit for a movie star. She was known to hold court there, inviting her favorites in for drinks while ignoring those she felt were beneath her. Her arrogance was not just about vanity, it was about control. She would often rewrite her own lines if she felt they were not dramatic enough, turning simple scenes into grand performances that overshadowed everyone else in the shot. She had a habit of upstaging younger actresses, using her physical presence and charisma to draw the camera's eye away from them. To Pat, every scene was a monologue, and the other actors were merely there to provide the pauses. This overwhelming sense of self-importance eventually led to her first departure from the show in 1973. She believed she was destined for international film stardom and that Coronation Street was holding her back. She left in a blaze of publicity, convinced that Hollywood was waiting for her. When that dream did not materialize as she had hoped, she returned to the street in 1976, but her ego had not diminished in the slightest. If anything, her time away had only solidified her belief that the show needed her to survive. She negotiated a salary that was reportedly the highest in British television at the time, a fact she made sure everyone knew. Her final years on the show were marked by a queen-like dominance. She would often criticize the scripts loudly in front of the writers, claiming that Elsie wouldn't say that, effectively merging her own personality with the character until they were indistinguishable. When she finally left the show for good in 1984, it was the end of an era. Pat Phoenix was a woman who had willed herself into stardom through sheer force of personality. She died in 1986, just days after marrying her long-term partner, Tony Booth. She remained to the very end a woman who demanded the spotlight, a star who believed the world was her stage and everyone else was simply lucky to be in the audience. Her legacy is one of undeniable charisma, but also of a towering ego that refused to be tamed by anyone. Julie Goodyear. If Pat Phoenix was the original siren of the cobbles, Julie Goodyear was the woman who seized the crown and turned it into a weapon of mass intimidation. As the leopard print-wearing, beehive-sporting barmaid Bette Lynch, she became the undisputed queen of Coronation Street throughout the 1980s and 90s. To the public, she was the brassy, vulnerable heart of the show, a character so beloved that she was practically royalty. However, behind the scenes at Granada Studios, Julie Goodyear did not just play a queen, she expected to be treated like one by every single person who crossed her path. Following the departure of the old guard, she ascended to a position of power that was absolute, and she ruled the roost with a mixture of terrifying silence and overwhelming flamboyance that left her co-stars walking on eggshells. Her arrival on set was never a simple affair. It was a royal procession. She drove a white Mercedes with a personalized number plate, a symbol of her status that separated her from the rest of the cast before she even stepped out of the car. Julie did not mix with the ensemble in the way the original cast had done. She established a court within the green room, a designated area where she would sit, cigarette in hand, and decide who was worthy of her attention that day. Young actors joining the show in the 1980s were often warned by the crew to approach her with extreme caution. To be ignored by Julie was painful, but to be the target of her displeasure was a professional nightmare. She had a way of looking through people she considered unimportant, rendering them invisible with a single, dismissive glance that could shatter a newcomer's confidence before they had even delivered a line. The atmosphere she cultivated was one of intense reverence and fear. She was known to have her own private toilet, a luxury that was unheard of for a soap actress in Manchester, and woe betide anyone who dared to use it. On set, her word was law. If she felt a scene was not working, or if a director tried to give her a note she disagreed with, she would simply stop. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. She knew the production relied entirely on her character's popularity to keep the ratings high, and she used this leverage to ensure everything was done exactly to her liking. She would often dictate how scenes should be played, overshadowing directors who were theoretically in charge. Her comedic timing was genius, but her timing for a power play was even better. She knew exactly when to exert her influence to remind everyone who the real star of the program was. This godlike complex extended to her contract negotiations, which were the stuff of industry legend. She demanded and received a salary that dwarfed that of her colleagues, reinforcing the hierarchy that she sat at the very top of. She believed that Coronation Street was the Julie Goodyear show in all but name. When the storylines did not revolve around her, her interest notably waned. She would often hold up filming due to exhaustion or personal matters, keeping the entire cast and crew waiting for hours, yet no one dared to reprimand her. The producers were terrified of losing their golden goose. This indulgence only fueled her belief that she was bigger than the institution itself. When she finally decided to leave the show in 1995, the media frenzy was comparable to a royal abdication. The viewing figures for her departure were astronomical, confirming in her mind that she was indeed the most important woman in Britain. However, her return for a brief stint years later proved to be a difficult reality check. The landscape of television had changed, the ensemble cast had moved on, and the deference she once commanded was no longer automatic. She struggled to regain that same level of dominance in a world that had learned to survive without her. Julie Goodyear remains a television legend, but her legacy behind the scenes is one of a woman who built a fortress of ego so high that, eventually, she became a prisoner within her own tower of leopard print and lonely stardom. Joan Collins. If the previous names on this list were queens of the soap opera, Joan Collins was the empress of the universe, a woman who did not just inhabit the role of a diva, but defined it for an entire generation. When she swept into the American drama dynasty in 1981, as the vengeful Alexis Carrington, she was not merely joining a cast, she was rescuing a sinking ship. The show was on the verge of cancellation, languishing in the ratings, until this British powerhouse arrived with her shoulder pads, her clipped English accent, and a gaze that could freeze a volcano. Joan Collins knew exactly what she was worth, and she made sure that every single executive, producer, and co-star knew it too. She did not suffer from an ego. She suffered from the absolute certainty that she was the most important person in Hollywood, and for a large part of the 1980s, she was arguably correct. Her arrival turned the show into a global phenomenon, and she wielded this fact like a diamond-encrusted sword. The set of Dynasty was less of a workplace and more of a battlefield where Joan fought for dominance every single day. Her contract negotiations became legendary battles of will. She demanded a salary that matched her male co-star, John Forsythe, a request that was unheard of in the industry at the time. When the studio refused, she simply refused to come to work. She would stay in her mansion, sipping champagne, while the entire production ground to a halt, costing the studio thousands of dollars an hour. She knew they could not film without her, and she played a high-stakes game of chicken that she almost always won. This did not endear her to her colleagues. Forsythe, an old-school actor who believed in humility and hierarchy, reportedly loathed her. He refused to speak to her off-camera for an entire season, leading to an atmosphere on set that was thicker with tension than the dramatic plots being filmed. Joan's demands were specific and non-negotiable. She insisted on having approval over her costumes, her hairstyles, and even the lighting. If a light was not positioned to perfectly flatter her bone structure, she would stop the scene and wait, arms folded, until the cinematographer fixed it. She famously refused to be seen in anything she considered drab or matronly, rewriting the visual language of the show to suit her own glamorous image. To Joan, Alexis was not a character. She was an extension of herself, and she protected that image with the ferocity of a lioness. She clashed with directors who tried to tone down her performance, telling them that the audience tuned in to see her, not to see realism. She was the villain the world loved to hate, and she absorbed that adoration until it became her reality. Her rivalry with her on-screen nemesis, Linda Evans, was often played up by the press, but the real friction was always about status. Joan felt that as the savior of the show, she should be treated with the highest reverence. She would often arrive on set at the very last second, stepping out of her limousine with seconds to spare, leaving the rest of the cast waiting in the sweltering heat of the studio lights. She did not apologize. Queens do not apologize for being late. She operated on her own time zone. When the show finally ended in 1989, Joan did not fade away. She continued to live her life as if the cameras were still rolling, maintaining a level of glamour and haughtiness that kept the world at arm's length. She was a woman who believed she had conquered America single-handedly, and in her mind, she had earned the right to look down on the mere mortals who had simply come along for the ride. Her legacy is one of pure, unadulterated star power, proving that sometimes, if you act like a god for long enough, the world will eventually start to believe you. Wendy Richard. For over 20 years, she was the quintessential face of the East End, playing the long-suffering Pauline Fowler in the BBC's flagship soap opera EastEnders. Having already achieved fame in the 1970s as the glamorous Miss Brahms in Are You Being Served? Wendy Richard was one of the few cast members who arrived at Elstree Studios in 1985 with a pre-established profile. However, this veteran status came with a sense of entitlement that would dominate the production for over 2 decades. Wendy did not just act in EastEnders. She viewed herself as the moral compass and the chief protector of the show's traditions. Over time, this protective instinct curdled into a rigid, unyielding arrogance. She believed she had a divine right to dictate the direction of the program, and she treated any dissent from writers, directors, or younger actors as a personal insult to her legacy. The atmosphere on the set of Albert Square was often dictated by Wendy's mood. She was known to be incredibly set in her ways, and she possessed a sharp, cutting tongue that she used to maintain her position at the top of the hierarchy. If a new actor joined the cast, they had to pass the Wendy test. She would observe them from her seat in the studio canteen, and if she decided they were not proper or did not show her the appropriate level of deference, she would make their professional life a misery. She was notorious for correcting other actors' performances, often in front of the entire crew, which many found deeply humiliating. She believed she knew her character, Pauline, better than any writer ever could. If she received a script that she disliked, she would famously march to the executive producer's office and demand it be changed, often using her status as an original cast member to hold the production hostage. Her arrogance reached its peak during her final years on the show. She became increasingly resistant to any character development that she felt undermined her status. When the writers proposed a storyline where her character would remarry, Wendy was reportedly furious, believing that Pauline would never betray the memory of her late husband. She viewed the character as an extension of her own ego, and when the producers finally refused to back down in 2006, she quit the show in a blaze of righteous indignation. She truly believed that without her, EastEnders would collapse. She gave interviews suggesting that the show had lost its way and that she was the only one who truly understood its soul. This belief in her own indispensability was her defining trait. She saw herself as the queen of the BBC, and she expected the corporation to bow to her every whim. Behind the scenes, her demands for special treatment were constant. She insisted on a specific schedule that suited her lifestyle and was known to be very vocal if she felt she was being overworked compared to the younger cast members. She did not like change, and she made it her mission to ensure that the studio operated on her terms. While she was undoubtedly a professional who never missed a call, her professionalism was wrapped in a layer of cold, distant superiority. She did not socialize with the wider cast, preferring to maintain a barrier between herself and those she deemed less experienced. When she passed away in 2009, she was remembered as a television legend, but those who worked closely with her remembered a woman who ruled her domain with an uncompromising and often intimidating sense of her own importance. She was a star who believed she owned the ground she walked on, and she made sure everyone else remembered it. Margaret Lockwood. In the mid-20th century, Margaret Lockwood was the undisputed queen of British cinema, a woman whose name above the title guaranteed a box office sensation. Known for her iconic role in The Wicked Lady in 1945, she was the first British actress to embrace the persona of the nasty woman on screen. However, as the decades rolled into the 1960s and 70s, Margaret did not merely age gracefully. She retreated into a fortress of her own legend. She possessed a formidable, almost regal arrogance that belonged to an era of studio contracts and absolute control. She did not just believe she was a star, she felt she was the last of a dying breed of true cinematic royalty, and she treated everyone from junior directors to seasoned co-stars with a polite but chillingly distant superiority that made it clear she considered herself a being of a higher order. Her return to television in the 1970s, most notably in the series Justice, was marked by a series of demands that left the production crew breathless. Margaret did not negotiate. She issued edicts. She insisted that she be filmed only from certain angles and that the lighting must always recreate the soft, ethereal glow of the 1930s Hollywood sets she had once inhabited. If a cinematographer dared to use modern, harsh lighting, she would simply walk off the set without a word, retreating to her dressing room until the mistake was corrected. She viewed the new generation of actors and technicians as amateurs who lacked the discipline and glamour of her heyday. This disdain was rarely shouted. It was delivered through a raised eyebrow or a sharp, aristocratic silence that was far more effective at silencing a room than any outburst. The atmosphere on her sets was one of extreme formality, dictated entirely by her presence. She refused to be addressed by her first name, insisting that everyone, including the directors, call her Miss Lockwood. She did not eat in the communal canteen, viewing the idea of mingling with the crew as an unthinkable breach of decorum. Instead, she held court in her private quarters, where only a select few were granted an audience. Her arrogance was rooted in a deep belief that the magic of stardom required a barrier between the idol and the worshipper. She was known to be incredibly difficult during rehearsals, often refusing to repeat a scene more than twice, claiming that a true professional should get it right immediately. If a co-star fumbled their lines, she would stare at them with a look of icy disappointment that suggested they were wasting her precious time. This sense of being a living monument eventually led to her withdrawal from public life. As the industry moved toward a more gritty and naturalistic style in the 1980s, Margaret found the lack of proper respect and glamour intolerable. She chose to become a recluse in her home in Kingston-upon-Thames, refusing to be seen by a public that might witness her as anything less than the goddess she had been. She turned down dozens of lucrative roles because she felt they were beneath her dignity, or did not offer her the top billing she felt was her birthright. She spent her final years surrounded by the trophies of her past, a woman who had successfully frozen time to protect her ego. When she passed away in 1990, she left behind a legacy of immense talent, but also the memory of a woman who truly believed that the sun rose and set according to her royal command. Elsie Randolph. While her name might not ring as many bells today as the queens of the soaps, Elsie Randolph was a woman who carried the torch of old-school theatrical arrogance well into the 1980s. A veteran of the stage and screen who had worked with the likes of Alfred Hitchcock in the 1930s, she viewed the modern era of television as a vulgar necessity. When she appeared in various character roles during the 60s and 70s, she did not just arrive on set, she descended upon it like a visiting monarch from a forgotten empire. Elsie believed that her decades of experience gave her a status that was beyond reproach, and she treated the younger generation of television professionals with a patronizing air that was as thick as the theatrical grease paint she still favored. She was a woman who lived in a permanent state of performance, convinced that she was the last living guardian of real acting. Her behavior on the set of various British dramas was marked by a series of grand, non-negotiable rituals. She insisted on being greeted by the director personally every morning, and if this courtesy was not extended, she would remain in her car, refusing to acknowledge the start of the working day. She had an extraordinary sense of her own importance, often lecturing cast members on their diction and posture, regardless of whether they had asked for her advice. She viewed herself as a deity of the West End, and she expected the television crew to treat the studio floor like a sacred temple. She was known to be incredibly difficult regarding her wardrobe, often bringing her own fur coats and jewelry from home, claiming that the production's costumes were rubbish and unfit for a lady of the theater. The stories of her interactions with directors are particularly revealing of her god complex. If a director asked her to move to a different spot for technical reasons, she would often refuse, stating that Mr. Hitchcock never required such a thing. She used her past associations with legendary figures as a shield against any form of modern criticism or direction. Her arrogance was of the most exhausting kind, the kind that is wrapped in polite, old-fashioned language but is nonetheless immovable. She would often hold up filming to tell long, rambling anecdotes about the 1930s, and woe betide any assistant director who tried to hurry her along. She believed that her presence alone was the greatest gift the production could receive, and therefore, time was a concept that did not apply to her. In her final roles, such as her appearance in the 1972 film Frenzy, she maintained this air of untouchable superiority. She did not socialize with the rank and file of the crew, and she made it clear that she found the technical aspects of modern filmmaking to be a tedious distraction from her art. She was a woman who had willed herself into a position of eternal stardom, even as the world around her changed beyond recognition. When she passed away in 1989, it was the end of a specific type of British arrogance, the kind that believed a posh accent and a storied past were enough to command the world. She remained, until her final breath, a woman who believed she was a goddess, temporarily trapped in a world of mere mortals, forever waiting for the curtain call that would return her to her rightful throne.